The summer of 1187 saw the Holy Land baking under a merciless sun. For nearly 9 decades, Christian kingdoms had maintained their precarious grip on the Levant, a finger of European civilization pointing into the heart of the Muslim world. Jerusalem, captured in the First Crusade, stood as the jewel in the Christian crown, a symbol of triumph, faith, and divine favor. But symbols, no matter how cherished, can crumble. The Kingdom of Jerusalem found itself facing a nightmare made flesh. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Where previous Muslim leaders had been divided and disorganized, Saladin united the Islamic world under a single banner, with Jerusalem firmly in his sights. The Christian forces were led by King Guy of Lusignan, a controversial monarch whose claim to the throne came through marriage rather than merit. When Saladin besieged the Christian fortress at Tiberias, Guy faced a pivotal decision: march his army across the parched landscape to meet Saladin's forces, or maintain defensive positions near water sources. Against wiser counsel, Guy chose to march. By July 3, 1187, the Christian army of some 20,000 men found themselves surrounded at the Horns of Hattin. Saladin's forces had seized the water sources, leaving the Crusader army to suffer under the blistering heat. Dehydration weakened them before a single arrow was fired. The next day's battle was less a contest than an execution. The thirst-maddened Christians broke ranks to reach a nearby lake, only to be cut down by Saladin's disciplined forces. By day's end, the military might of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been utterly destroyed. The aftermath was catastrophic. With no army to defend it, the Holy Land fell piece by piece. Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, city after city surrendered to Saladin's advancing forces. Then came the unthinkable. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem itself fell. After a brief siege, Saladin's banners flew over the holy city for the first time since 1099. Unlike the Christian conquest nearly a century before, which had ended in widespread slaughter, Saladin showed remarkable restraint. Christians were permitted to leave the city upon payment of a ransom. Those who couldn't pay were sold into slavery, but the bloodshed was minimal, a stark contrast to the Crusader conquest that had left the streets running red with Muslim and Jewish blood. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe by late autumn, striking like a thunderbolt. Pope Urban III allegedly died of shock upon hearing the news. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade to retake the Holy City. The response was extraordinary. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, King Philip II of France, and King Richard I of England, 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs, all took the cross. The Third Crusade would be led not by lesser nobles or adventurers, but by the crowned heads of Western Christendom themselves. As November 1888 dawned, preparations began across Europe. Taxes were levied, ships commissioned, supplies gathered. An unprecedented military endeavor was taking shape, one that would pit Christianity's greatest champions against the Muslim world's most formidable leader. The stage was set for a clash that would define an era, as kings and sultans prepared to battle for the most contested city on earth. Jerusalem awaited its fate, caught between the cross and the crescent, between the will of Christ and the sword of Allah. Europe's response to Jerusalem's fall was unprecedented. 3 mighty kings, each formidable in his own right, answered the call to holy war. The aging Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, was first to depart in May 1189. A legendary figure with nearly 4 decades of rule behind him, Barbarossa commanded an army of 100,000 men, the largest single crusading force ever assembled. The German emperor chose the land route through Hungary and Byzantine territory. Initially making good progress, his relations with the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelus soured when Isaac, fearing Barbarossa's might, made secret alliances with Saladin. The Germans forced their way through Byzantine lands, defeating an ambush attempt, and entered Turkish territory in Asia Minor. Against considerable odds, Barbarossa's disciplined forces overcame Turkish resistance at the Battle of Iconium in May 1190. Victory seemed within grasp as the Germans approached the Holy Land. Then came catastrophe. On June 10, 1190, while crossing the Salif River in Cilicia, Barbarossa drowned. Historical accounts differ. Some say he was bathing, others that his horse lost footing while crossing. But the result was devastating. Without their emperor's formidable leadership, the German army disintegrated. Many returned home, others continued to Antioch, where an epidemic further decimated their ranks. By the time the remnants reached Acre, Barbarossa's mighty host had dwindled to a shadow. Meanwhile, the kings of France and England prepared their own departures. Philip II Augustus, calculating and methodical, and Richard I, bold and martial, were rivals as much as allies. Both had inherited thrones recently and faced similar challenges in raising funds for the expensive campaign ahead. Richard implemented what became known as the Saladin tithe, demanding 1/10 of all revenues and movable properties from his subjects. To raise additional funds, he famously declared, "I would sell London itself if I could find a buyer." Philip employed similar methods in France, though with less dramatic flair. The two kings agreed to travel together, avoiding the perilous land route that had proven fatal for Barbarossa. They departed in July 1190, leading their armies to Sicily. There, complications arose immediately. Richard's sister Joan was widow to the recently deceased Sicilian king, and her dowry had been seized by the new monarch, Tancred. Richard promptly captured Messina, forcing Tancred to return Joan's possessions and pay an indemnity. This show of force caused the first cracks in Richard and Philip's alliance. The French king, already resentful of Richard's greater wealth and military reputation, grew increasingly wary of the English monarch's ambitions. They wintered in Sicily, delaying their departure until spring 1191. When they finally sailed, disaster struck again. A violent storm scattered the fleet, driving Richard's ships to Cyprus. When some vessels wrecked on the Cypriot shore, the island's ruler, Isaac Comnenus, imprisoned the survivors and seized their cargo. Richard diverted his entire force to Cyprus, conquering the island in just 3 weeks, a stunning display of military efficiency that served multiple purposes. It secured a valuable base for Crusader operations, punished Comnenus for his treatment of shipwrecked Crusaders, and significantly enhanced Richard's treasury through captured booty. On Cyprus, Richard also celebrated his marriage to Berengaria of Navarre, whom his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine had brought to meet him. With his new bride, a conquered island, and his reputation for martial prowess enhanced, Richard finally sailed for the Holy Land in early June 1191. Philip, meanwhile, had already reached Acre, where Christian forces had been besieging the Muslim-held city for nearly 2 years. The siege had become a stalemate, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The arrival of the French king brought fresh hope to the Christian forces, but the decisive turn would come only with the appearance of the warrior king who was already earning the name that would echo through history: Richard the Lionheart. Acre had once been a jewel of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, its harbor a vital link to Europe. Now, since August 1189, the city had been under siege by Christian forces determined to wrest it back from Saladin's control. The arrival of Philip of France in April 1191 had boosted morale, but the siege remained a bloody stalemate. The Christians occupied a narrow strip of land between the city walls, and Saladin's relief army camped on the surrounding hills. disease ran rampant through the Crusader camp, where soldiers fought not only the enemy, but dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition. When Richard's fleet appeared on the horizon in June 1191, the besiegers erupted in celebration. Richard, however, arrived gravely ill with what chronicles describe as arnaldia, likely scurvy. Despite his condition, he immediately took command, ordering the construction of massive siege engines. Most impressive was a huge trebuchet nicknamed God's Own Catapult, capable of hurling massive stones against Acre's formidable walls. The English king brought a revolutionary approach to the battlefield. While bedridden, he had himself carried on a silk litter to oversee operations, offering gold pieces to any crusader who could dislodge a stone from the walls. His crossbowmen maintained constant pressure on Acre's defenders, making it perilous for them to show themselves above the battlements. Tensions between Richard and Philip quickly resurfaced. The French king resented how Richard overshadowed him despite arriving later. When Richard recovered from his illness, he personally led attacks against the city, further enhancing his reputation. Philip, meanwhile, fell ill himself, adding to his mounting frustration. By early July, the combined pressure from the Crusader forces had brought Acre's defenders to the breaking point. Saladin, watching from the hills, could not break through the Crusader lines to relieve the city. On July 12, 1191, after a siege lasting nearly 2 years, Acre surrendered. The terms were harsh but pragmatic. The Muslim garrison would be allowed to leave, but the city's Christian residents, imprisoned when Saladin captured Acre years earlier, would be freed. Additionally, Saladin would return the True Cross, a relic captured at Hattin, release 1,500 Christian prisoners, and pay 200,000 gold pieces as ransom. With Acre secured, Philip made a decision that would alter the course of the crusade. He announced his intention to return to France. Officially, he cited illness, but political calculations played a larger role. His rival, Count Philip of Flanders, had died without an heir, leaving valuable territories contested. Moreover, Richard's growing prominence diminished the French king's stature with each passing day. Before departing in August 1191, Philip pledged to not attack Richard's lands in his absence, a promise he would not keep. He left behind a contingent of French troops under the command of the Duke of Burgundy, but the crusade had effectively become Richard's operation. With Philip gone, Richard faced his first major crisis. The deadline for Saladin's payment and the release of prisoners passed without full compliance. The English king, pragmatic and ruthless, made a fateful decision that would stain his reputation. On August 20th, he ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners outside Acre, men, women, and children who had surrendered expecting honorable treatment. This massacre horrified contemporaries on both sides. Saladin, in retaliation, executed his Christian captives. The war had taken a darker turn, with quarter now rarely given in subsequent battles. Richard knew that holding Acre was meaningless without recapturing Jerusalem. As August ended, he prepared his army for the march south along the Mediterranean coast. Ahead lay some of the most challenging terrain in the Holy Land, and an enemy determined to exact revenge for Acre's fall and the slaughter of its people. The Lionheart had won his first major victory in the Holy Land, but Jerusalem remained distant, and Saladin's main force was largely intact. The true test of Richard's military genius and the fate of the Third Crusade would be decided on the coastal road to Jaffa. By early April, Ukrainian forces had reclaimed control of the entire Kyiv region. The world soon witnessed the horrific aftermath of Russian occupation. In Busha, international journalists documented streets littered with civilian bodies, many with hands bound behind their backs and showing signs of execution. Satellite imagery confirmed these civilians had been killed during the Russian occupation. contradicting Moscow's claims of a staged provocation. Mass graves containing hundreds of bodies were discovered near churches and in public parks. Survivors recounted systematic searches of homes, with Russian soldiers looking for government officials, military veterans, or anyone with nationalist symbols. Those found were often detained or summarily executed. Evidence of torture chambers in basements and garages emerged, with victims bearing signs of beatings, burns, and other abuse. The Bucha massacre became a turning point in international perception of the conflict. What Putin had framed as a limited special military operation was revealed as a brutal campaign with apparent war crimes at its core. Western nations, already supplying Ukraine with defensive weapons, now accelerated and expanded their military aid. Sanctions against Russia intensified, and diplomatic isolation of Moscow deepened. For Ukrainians, the discoveries in Bucha and other liberated towns reinforced their determination to resist. Any lingering notions of negotiated surrender evaporated. President Zelensky visited the devastated suburb, visibly shaken by what he witnessed. "These are war crimes," he declared, "and they will be recognized by the world as genocide." The Russian retreat from Kyiv represented a stunning reversal of fortunes. What had been envisioned as a 3-day operation to decapitate the Ukrainian government had turned into a humiliating defeat. Military analysts reassessed Russia's capabilities, noting significant tactical, logistical, and leadership failures. The myth of Russian military prowess had been severely damaged. For Ukraine, the successful defense of Kyiv provided a critical morale boost and strategic breathing room. Resources could now be redirected to the eastern and southern fronts, where Russian forces maintained offensive operations. The capital, while still occasionally targeted by long-range missiles, was no longer under immediate threat of ground assault. The battle's aftermath revealed a staggering toll. Thousands of civilians had been killed, with many more injured. Entire neighborhoods in Kyiv's suburbs lay in ruins. Infrastructure damage was extensive. Bridges destroyed, water systems compromised, electrical grids damaged. Early estimates suggested rebuilding would cost billions and take years. Environmental damage was also severe. Russian military operations had contaminated soil and water sources. Unexploded ordnance rendered large areas dangerous. Ecological recovery would require extensive remediation efforts alongside physical reconstruction. As Ukrainian authorities began the grim task of documenting war crimes, forensic teams from international organizations arrived to assist. Evidence collection became a priority, with prosecutors building cases for future tribunals. Witness testimonies were recorded, sites photographed, and evidence preserved according to international legal standards. For residents returning to liberated areas, the homecoming was bittersweet. Many found their homes destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Those whose houses remained standing often discovered them looted, with Russian soldiers having taken everything from electronics to toilet seats. The psychological trauma of occupation would linger long after the physical damage was repaired. In Moscow, the failure to capture Kyiv forced a strategic reassessment. Russian propaganda shifted to emphasizing the Donbass region as having been the primary objective all along, a transparent attempt to reframe defeat as planned strategy. Military leadership underwent changes, with commanders blamed for the failure relieved of duty. By mid-April, the Battle of Kyiv had conclusively ended. Ukrainian forces had achieved what many thought impossible: repelling a numerically superior invader and preserving their capital. The victory came at immense cost, but it demonstrated Ukraine's resilience and fighting capability to a world that had largely underestimated both. The successful defense of Kyiv fundamentally altered the trajectory of the entire war. What Russia had planned as a rapid regime change operation had transformed into a protracted conflict with no clear end in sight. The Ukrainian victory established several crucial precedents that would shape the conflict's subsequent phases. First, it demonstrated that Ukraine's military, despite being outgunned and outnumbered, could effectively counter Russian forces through superior tactics, motivation, and territorial knowledge. The David versus Goliath narrative resonated globally, increasing international support for Ukraine's cause. Countries that had initially hesitated to provide lethal aid now committed to substantial military assistance packages. Second, the battle exposed critical weaknesses in Russia's military doctrine and capabilities: poor coordination between air and ground forces, inadequate logistics, low morale among conscripts, and inflexible command structures all contributed to the Russian failure. These problems would persist as the conflict shifted eastward, preventing Russia from fully capitalizing on its numerical advantages. Third, the Battle of Kiev solidified President Zelensky's transformation from a political newcomer with low approval ratings to a wartime leader of international standing. His decision to remain in Kiev despite the danger, captured in his simple statement, "I am here," became emblematic of Ukrainian resistance. His leadership style, combining authenticity with strategic communication, proved remarkably effective in maintaining national unity and international support. The battle also highlighted the crucial role of modern technology in contemporary warfare. Ukrainian forces effectively employed drones for reconnaissance and striking Russian positions. Secure communications platforms allowed for coordinated defense efforts. Satellite imagery provided by Western partners gave Ukrainian commanders valuable intelligence on Russian movements. Meanwhile, smartphones in civilian hands documented Russian atrocities in real time, preventing Moscow from controlling the narrative. For the residents of Kiev and surrounding areas, recovery began slowly. People returned to their homes when possible, clearing debris and rebuilding. Schools reopened where safe to do so, sometimes in basement classrooms to protect against potential air raids. Business owners repaired shops and restaurants, determined to restore normalcy despite ongoing air raid sirens. The psychological impact of the battle would prove lasting. Many civilians, especially children, showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Mental health services were overwhelmed with cases. Yet alongside the trauma emerged remarkable resilience. Community support networks strengthened, with neighbors helping neighbors in the massive recovery effort. Internationally, the battle created a new geopolitical reality. NATO, which had faced questions about its relevance in the post-Cold War era, found renewed purpose in countering Russian aggression. Finland and Sweden abandoned decades of neutrality to seek membership in the alliance, a direct consequence of Russia's actions in Ukraine. The European Union moved to reduce dependence on Russian energy, accelerating renewable energy initiatives and diversifying supply sources. For Russia, the failure at Kiev proved costly beyond military losses. Economic sanctions began to bite, causing inflation and shortages. International companies withdrew from the Russian market. Brain drain accelerated as educated Russians, opposed to the war and facing increasing repression, fled the country. Russia's international standing deteriorated as evidence of war crimes mounted. Ukrainian identity, meanwhile, crystallized in unprecedented ways. Russian-speaking Ukrainians who had previously maintained cultural and linguistic ties to Russia now embraced their Ukrainian identity more firmly. The invasion had achieved the opposite of Putin's stated goal of bringing Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence. It had instead cemented Ukraine's Western orientation and national cohesion. By summer 2022, though the war's focus had shifted to eastern and southern Ukraine, the Battle of Kiev remained a powerful symbol. The city's skyline, still intact despite Russian efforts, represented Ukrainian sovereignty preserved through sacrifice and determination. The blue and yellow Ukrainian flag flew over government buildings that, according to Russian plans, should have been occupied by Moscow's proxies. Thus, what began as Russia's attempt to quickly decapitate the Ukrainian government instead became a watershed moment in post-Soviet history. The battle where Ukraine demonstrated to the world and to itself that it would not surrender its independence without a fight. The echoes of the Battle of Kiev continued to resonate. What was intended as a swift operation to subjugate Ukraine instead became a turning point that fundamentally altered European security architecture and global geopolitics. The spirited defense of Kiev revealed the hollow core of Russian military power while showcasing Ukrainian resilience and Western solidarity. Military historians now study the battle as a textbook example of how determined defenders with appropriate support can defeat a numerically superior force. The Ukrainian tactics, flexible, decentralized command structures, effective use of anti-tank weapons, and exploitation of urban terrain have influenced defense planning across Eastern Europe. For Kiev itself, the battle's legacy is visible in its transformed cityscape. Checkpoints and fortifications have become semi-permanent features. Anti-aircraft systems remain positioned throughout the metropolitan area. Museums already document the invasion with exhibits of destroyed Russian equipment and testimonials from survivors. Schools teach children about the battle as a defining moment in national history. The human cost remains incalculable. Beyond the immediate casualties, thousands suffer from physical and psychological wounds that may never fully heal. Families torn apart by death or displacement face a future permanently altered by those crucial weeks of combat. Yet, amid the tragedy emerged remarkable stories of courage and humanity. The territorial defense volunteers who took up arms with minimal training. The doctors who performed surgeries by flashlight during power outages. The ordinary citizens who sheltered strangers in their basements during bombardments. These acts of individual bravery collectively formed the foundation of Ukraine's national resistance. The Battle of Kiev shattered numerous assumptions that had guided international relations since the Cold War's end. It demonstrated that large-scale conventional warfare remains possible in 21st century Europe. It revealed the limitations of economic interdependence as a guarantor of peace. And it showed that the rules-based international order requires active defense from those who believe in its principles. As Ukraine continues its fight for sovereignty, the successful defense of Kiev stands as both inspiration and warning, a testament to the power of national will and a reminder that freedom ultimately requires sacrifice. The city endures, scarred but unbroken, its golden dome still catching the sunlight above a nation fighting for its very existence.